Hi, I'm Liz Chavez, and I am an ESL teacher. I teach ESL, English as a Second Language, to kindergarten through fifth grade students. And this is a presentation about the importance of using multicultural children's literature in your classroom as well as in your instruction. Okay, so I've called this Top Tips for Using Diverse Texts. And just something to think about with the word diverse. Diverse doesn't always mean non-white. It can mean inclusive in lots of different ways. So, for example, most of the texts that teachers use often feature a middle-class family or an upper middle-class family with a mom and a dad, a brother, a sister, a dog, and they live in a house. And so one way to really diversify your text is to read about children who ride the city bus. Read about families who have two moms. Read about families who live in an apartment. Read about families who are blended, where you have a stepmom and a stepdad. Read about families who the mother works 6 days a week and they only have one day off. Read about families where they live with their grandparents. So there's lots of different types of diversity, as well as racial diversity, linguistic diversity, just anything that's not like what we typically see in a book. And just personally, I am a stepmom, and my family is a blended family in two ways. My family, I'm a stepmom, and so I have one daughter who goes to, we have 50% custody of her, so she's with her mom and her dad. And then we also, my husband is Mexican, and I'm white, and so our family is blended in that way too. And so whenever I read books for my kids, and there's a book that has one of those types of identities in it, it's so nice to see myself, if there's a stepmom in a book, or if there's a family that's multiracial. My daughter loves to read about Marisol because she's half Peruvian and half white. And so it's neat to see yourself in multitudes of ways. So here are the things that I thought would be very helpful. The first one is to prioritize own voices text or own voices books. And what that means, what an own voice book means is that the author and or the illustrator, hopefully both, are of the community that is represented in the book. So if the book is about a Black family, then the author and illustrator should be Black. If the book is written about Dominican family, it's best if the author is also Dominican. It's coming from the same perspective. So they're not writing about others. They have that personal experience. It's important for authenticity of the text. It's also important for economical reasons to me. I think that Black and brown and people of color should be profiting off their own stories. And so that's just something to really keep in mind when you're buying books. Another important part is oftentimes teachers read about particularly African American history during February, and all of the books that have Black characters or Black families or Black experience in them, it's about people who have been enslaved and it's about civil rights. We need to make sure that we're reading books about all types of students and all types of families that show joy and not just share a struggle. That even if there may be poverty in the book, that it's not a negative experience. It's important that all kind of kids see themselves as the hero of the story, as just a normal family having a birthday party. So just keep that in mind. Something else that I find really important is to look for modern, relevant texts. Teachers really get in this habit of reading the same book every year. At the beginning of the year, we always read Wimberly Worried, and we always read Chrysanthemum, and we always read these same books over and over. And if you've looked, at the data from 2018, there are very few diverse texts. So just imagine how many there were in the 90s. So some of the best books that I have come across are all new. When I'm making book lists that I post and giving suggestions, these books 9 out of 10 times have been made since 2017. So they're really newer, more relevant. They're talking about the things that kids are experiencing today. They're looking more diverse. They have a multitude of experiences that are interesting and engaging to children. And the illustration styles change over time. And so the illustration styles kind of match what kids are interested in now. They're more engaging. The next one is a big one. It's to review and read before using. Part of the reviewing that I try to do is I research the author before I buy the book, before I read the book. A good example is there are a lot of books that I used to have in my classroom that featured Black characters, particularly African stories. And after researching the authors, I discovered that many times the author was a white author who had gone to a country in Africa for some sort of like missionary work or something, and they've come back and written about the African experience. And I didn't really feel like that was a good thing to, it just wasn't very authentic. And so if I'm looking for an African story, I would need to find an African author. So just be mindful of that. The other thing that I have found that really helps is right here, you'll see create notes for pronunciations. I have a book on my shelf. It's called Suki's Kimono. And in that book, there's a lot, it's a Japanese book by a Japanese author. And there's a lot of terms, like Japanese words in it. And at the beginning of the story, she has made a key for you. It tells you how to pronounce these 6 or 7 terms that you'll see throughout the story. And so what I did is I just wrote a sticky note before I read it with my students that has, and I've just kept it in there years later, that has the pronunciation of whatever word's going to be on that page, so that I don't have to like panic, or I don't have to study or remember. I have a little note there. So that's something that I've always found helpful, and that might be helpful to you as well. So practice reading the pronunciations, make notes if you need to. Just put in the time so that the reading of the experience is authentic as it can be and as meaningful as it can be. It's important. And then my last thing to say is that when you're reading a diverse text, it doesn't have to be about like, look, we're reading a book about a Muslim family. It can be, we're studying cause and effect, but the family in the book is Muslim. We're studying how to tell the beginning, middle, and end of a story. Happens to be the girl in the book is Latina, so it's not that we're not studying the Latino community necessarily with this book. We're not studying the Muslim experience with this book. We are learning content with a book that represents the people in our classroom or represents people in the outer community. And that's something that will help lots of kids, but it's also nice to think about when you're constantly teaching. I'm an ESL teacher. So if I'm constantly using books of a culture that my students are not a part of to teach content, then they're having to learn content in a text with a culture that they're not familiar with. So learning to make inferences is much more challenging. Learning to spending time comprehending the text is more challenging because they're first unfamiliar with the language and the experience and the culture in the text, but they're also learning new content. So just think about if you can somehow minimize the mental work they're having to do to access the content. So if you have a group of all Latina students, read a book, that has a Latino family in it, they feel affirmed, they feel excited, they feel engaged, they feel heard, seen, valued. But also making inferences is a little bit easier because they're familiar with what's going on in the story. So that is something to keep in mind. And then I'll show another example. There are other books that do have this is a content, like this book here, it's learning shapes, but it has a Muslim architecture to learn shapes through. So if you do some research, you can find even books outside of the literacy content, outside of stories, you can bring in other cultures.